see here. I think there's like a small delay from our stream to YouTube. I guess we'll let a minute or so pass before we start so people can join in. I realized that I don't see the, oh, I do see the comments. That's good. Try and highlight one here just because of that. Hey, Daniel. But Sean, you will be the comment master for this.
All right, happy to do so. Hey, Munungi.
So we happens to be me and Sean who sit here now, but we have a bunch of like contributors in the chat. So I'm hoping that people can help out and answer questions and provide like more in-depth answers and stuff. We have a lot to try and cover. So we'll probably, I guess like I have a few sections where I think I'll speed through it just because there's other good stuff coming to cover. So any like clarifications and more in-depth stuff can go right in the chat, I guess. I guess we can do like a small introduction before we start with the slides. I don't have many slides, just it's a few of them, and then we're going to spend all of our time inside the editor and just test things. Hi Daniel here. That was enough showing. So I'm Gabriel. Most of you probably have at least seen my name before. I do a bunch of maintaining and stuff on ReScript and the ecosystem around it. And with me, I have none other than Sean.
Hey folks, I'm Sean. I've been working in ReScripts more quietly recently, but pretty fervently, and I use a lot of Gabriel's stuff in particular.
Nice. I always get interesting bug reports from Sean. I appreciate that, although maybe it doesn't always sound like it, but I do. So we can go ahead and just get started with the introduction here. So this is the first edition of the ReScript Online Meetup. We are planning to have these, well, kind of as frequently as we can muster, hoping for maybe once a month if we can. We'll see though. There's a lot to talk about. The intention with the meetup is both to kind of provide updates on what's going on with development in ReScript, but mostly just focus on the community and things being built, what's happening in the ecosystem, talking to companies who use ReScript in production and things like that. But this first one is obviously about ReScript version 11, which is right around the corner and comes packed with a lot of new features. So we have a lot to cover. We're going to try and keep the agenda fairly slim today. We're going to start with a segment I call ReScript Community News, which is basically short like news segments on what's going on in the community, all from like libraries being built or upgraded or maintained to things being built in the actual compiler. I envision like in later meetups we'll talk more about the actual development and what's going on right now, but now we have so much to cover with ReScript version 11, so we'll defer that for later. And then the bulk of the meetup is going to be about ReScript version 11. And any questions you have or anything you feel is like unclear or anything, just go ahead and post that in the chat, and we'll try and cover it as much as possible in the stream. And if we can't cover it or we don't have time, we'll make sure that someone answers them in the comments as well. So feel free to discuss in the comments. And also, finally, like a big shout out to all of the contributors who's been involved with ReScript version 11. It's been quite fantastic to see just how many people have appeared and who are doing like quality contributions to everything from the compiler to the editor extension to the website to everything around it. That's amazing and really, really nice. So without further ado, some community news, and I'm going to demo a few of these as well in actual code. But recently, smart line breaks for pipes landed. That sounds a bit vague maybe, but it's about formatting fast pipes. I'll show that in practice in the editor. We also had async components support land, so you can do React server components using async await, which is also something that kind of ties together ReScript and Next.js server components, or React server components for that matter. We've also worked a bunch on improved error messages, and we're really looking for feedback there. Error messages is obviously a huge topic, and we want to make them as good as we can, put whatever context in them that's needed for you to better understand what's actually going on. But we got to start somewhere. So we've started with a little bit of things around when you're trying to assign something of the wrong type, or you're trying to add things together, like adding an int and something that's not an int, and the kind of beginner things where you typically get stuck, where it's unintuitive for someone coming from JavaScript or TypeScript, for instance, that you can't add ints and floats together without converting them and using the right operators. So you'll notice that in version 11, and we're looking for any feedback around that. And if you have error messages that you stumble upon that you feel is unclear, don't hesitate to go on the forum and add that. There's a couple of threads running already where people have added things they found confusing, and where we've kind of gone back and forth with how we can improve it. Yeah, please do that. That's very important, and it's a great way to contribute. You don't have to actually change them. It's enough to just reproduce them and report them. We also have something called Rewatch, which is an alternate build system for ReScript that Jaap Froelich and Roland at Walnut have been building, mostly originally to solve monorepo issues with the current build system, but it's looking great overall. It's very performant, and I think they're finishing up some sort of first stable version of it. So you'll probably hear more about Rewatch coming up. And then I also want to mention ReScript Struct, which had a recent new major release. And ReScript Struct is a library for encoding and decoding data. And it focuses on performance, and it has a great footprint, and it's really fast, especially compared to other solutions in TypeScript land. So go ahead and check those out. If anyone want to help me with linking to both Rewatch and ReScript Struct in the comments, I would be very grateful. Yeah, so what's new in ReScript version 11? We are going to cover these things. MISC, of course, is just random stuff that's maybe not big enough for having its own kind of headline. But we're going to try and cover the other subjects in depth, and we'll some of them are more not important but larger than others, so we'll probably get stuck a little bit longer in, for example, Uncurried mode. That's a big one, whereas dynamic imports is slightly less to talk about, but still very important. There's on the website, maybe someone can link to this too. On the website, there's a series of blog posts. I think they're 4 now or something, that details all of the features we'll talk about, or at least I think all of them, and that shows you kind of why we built them, what they mean, and what they enable. So please go ahead and read those as well if you haven't already. They're really good and show you kind of in depth why things are built the way they are. So the small MISC stuff that we won't actually demo in the editor is recently support for ReScript.json landed. And that's essentially changing the name of bsconfig, which is a leftover from BuckleScript, but also taking the opportunity to clean up a few things in the config. I think we, for example, removed a couple of things that wasn't documented and no longer supported, and then also removed prefixes. Dev dependencies and dependencies were called BS dev dependencies, for instance, and we've changed them to just be called dependencies. So a cleanup. Now we're working to make all of the tools in the ecosystem understand this as well, because ReScript.json is obviously the future. And the editor tooling is almost there. So this is going to be the way going forward. bsconfig.json is going to work in v11 as well. I'm not sure if we've decided when we're stripping out the support for that overall, but still it's going to work just fine going forward as well. But you're encouraged to migrate it's a very simple migration, basically renaming and removing a few prefixes. And also we have a new thing called at that directive. It's which lets you kind of put in raw JavaScript at the very top of the file. I'm going to show you this in the editor. But this will let you do things like put a use client directive that you need for server components and client components in Next, for instance, but also put in a node, what do you call it? Shebang, hashbang, whatever, something that tells you that you can run the node file as a standalone script. I'll show this as well. And then Sean's favorite topic, we have some improvements to gentype. We've worked on making sure that more comments are propagated from your ReScript source to your TypeScript source. There's still a few things that aren't propagated, which we're looking to kind of finish up. Gentype is obviously very important to us because it provides such an easy link for putting your ReScript code inside of a TypeScript code base, and also publishing libraries built on ReScript, but that you can consume in both JavaScript and TypeScript as well. So we're interested, obviously, in having that work as well as it can. Another thing as well with gentype is I believe that with the changes we are going to be talking about now, with variants and whatnot, I think we've reached or are very close to reaching a point where gentype is fully runtime free. So there will be no like conversions from outside JavaScript values to ReScript values needed anymore. So gentype will act more as a TypeScript definition generator rather than a kind of a runtime layer between them as well. That's going to be good, I think. And finally, doc generation. This is something we've been lacking, and we've been working on some sort of like automatic doc generation where you can point a CLI at a file and then just essentially have that file spit you back a JSON structure with the contents. So drawing from like the type system overall, so you don't have to annotate your sources or anything. It all works on the type system level. We are getting ready to release that as a package soon. And that's exciting because we haven't really had a good solution for that yet. So any questions on that before we move on? Sean, my question and comments master.
Yeah, just as a heads up for the chat. So YouTube is filtering out any links pretty aggressively, but all this stuff is pretty easy to Google. So for example, ReScript struct, it'll be the top hit on Google. Yeah, so for some of the stuff like the doc generation, is that meant to be like an intermediate layer where maybe I could take that JSON structure and use it to generate my own internal HTML, or maybe I want to pull in some stuff and say generate, I don't know, a PDF or something like that?
Yeah, it'll be, I guess it'll be both kind of. It's going to be a JSON structure that you can put out, but we're also going to ship some sort of very basic setup that lets you dump Markdown, for instance. So people who just want to dump out docs can do that. But we already have someone use the proof of concept of this for building a REPL for ReScript. So just using it to extract type information. So I guess you could use it for that as well. But the main point is pulling out documentation for it. So it scans all of the compiled artifacts from the compiler and pulls out everything like records, the fields they have, if they're optional or not, what comments they have, what type they are, and then also the signatures as you'd expect them to be. So yeah.
And is that meant to be like a big reveal, or is that being developed in public somewhere?
It's being developed in public. It's in the editor tooling or VS Code extension repository because it reuses a lot of functionality from that. So it's available. It's merged to master as well a few days ago, I think. And we're working on. It's been like problematic figuring out how to expose it without getting stuck in too many tasks that aren't really helping us with the goal of getting it out there. It's a like sorely missing thing. I miss it for all of my libraries, for example. Yeah. Like I could really use it. So it's
familiar.
a balance. Yeah. What do you mean, Sean? I don't have docs for everything.
Kind of along those lines, Ryan has a good question. So, I mean, could you imagine, for example, the API documentation on the ReScript lane right now kind of being replaced with this, like using this to just keep everything up to date automatically?
Yeah, that's the main original like goal, I think, when
Very
this
cool.
started. So it's the intention was to just automate all of that, and dump out all of those things. So yeah, that's the point. Like I see it as in the future, you could have your own kind of flavor, of course, of how you want your docs to look, but it should be very easy to get good looking and fairly complete docs out just by generating. And if you want to customize things, it's a pretty simple structure with not too many pieces of information. So you should be able to write your own kind of markdown or PDF or whatever generator you want, HTML. Yeah, you could build a website from it just using JSX or whatever. It's just a JSON structure that will provide bindings to from ReScript as well. So you get in a nice kind of ReScript format with variants and stuff. So
very cool. I mean, I have lots of other questions on that, but I think we can move on for now.
yeah, it's not the main thing of this meetup though, although it's nice. Was there anything else in the chat before we move on?
I think that's kind of covering it. So just mainly links and trying to figure out questions around doc generation.
Cool. Let's jump into the editor. See my very concentrated face now as I try and find my tab. There we go. Cool. Okay, like a TV chef, I've prepared a couple of things here for us to watch, and yeah, I'm hoping I'll remember to do this in a good order. Actually, let me pull up my cheat sheet here. Right. So first, the first thing I want to show is the thing I was talking about in the slides, and that is at that directive that you can have this dump out anything at the very top of the file. And this was important because you could do this using raw before, but raw content isn't going to end up in the very top of the file. So if we do this instead, server, this ends up here below the imports, and that's a problem because that's that makes this whole directive thing not work. So this wasn't actually possible before, and it's useful for use client, use server, those directives, but it's also useful for this if you're writing scripts that you can output this. Do you know, Sean, what it's called? Is it a hashbang or shebang or what is it?
I think shipping.
Oh, nice. Learning those American words. Great. Yeah. So that's a cool thing that's been around since the early alphas, I believe, of version 11. Next thing that I also talked about is the smart pipe formatting. And we've had a kind of an issue in ReScript that this type of pipe chain, which has a couple of pipes on them, haven't really been possible to format in any other way than this. If you were to add more pipes to it, it would collapse on multiple lines, but there was no way to make something of just a few pipes collapse on multiple lines. But now, if you do this, it'll actually remember what you how you formatted it and put it on multiple lines. And this is going to improve readability in many cases, I think. I have a number of them myself. So this is a very welcome and good addition by Florian, who's in the somewhere here in the chat, I believe.
I'm curious, how does it compose? Like, if you were to nest it, so if you like copy from line 8 to line 10, and just replace the body of the array.map with that.
The body of this.
Yeah. Okay. So it just kind of nicely like two line spacing.
Yeah, kind of remembers. Yeah, and the point is that it should be remembering like how you put it. So I think, yeah, exactly. It can if you put it in honest. That's the smart part about it, right? Smart pipe. This was always possible with like record definitions and things like that, where you could put the first record key on or the first record field on a new line, and you'd get it expanded on multiple lines. And if you didn't put it on a new line, you'd get it on one line, for instance. But it arguably makes even more sense in the pipe case, just because, also like because pipes are so important in the language and they help so much with readability overall. This is great. Next thing is just a very, very brief look at the kind of new error messages. And I'm not going to show that many of them, but I am going to show just the general idea. And this is now telling you that this is an area, this area item has this type, and it's expected to have items of this type instead. And then it has a bunch of extra context kind of. We're going to be working on the formatting of the message itself, and it looks different in the terminal as well. That's going to be a work in progress. But before, this would be somewhere, this has type string, somewhere wanted type int. So we're trying to add context in as many places as possible and also provide solutions. So this is something we really want feedback on. So please do post on the forums if you try this out and you think something's unclear or you find more cases which you can cover. And another one which I personally had a hard time understanding before is this one, where you use a function, but you use the wrong kind of type for a function argument. And before this would say, this is type string, somewhere wanted int. And now it says this is type string, but this function argument is expecting int. And this one looks pretty innocent, but when you have a bunch of function arguments and they're labeled and they're not labeled, and you kind of mix them, and a lot of them maybe has bodies of things you're doing or switches or whatever, it's easy to kind of forget where you're at. So when you're in the middle of something like that, it's not always clear when you see red squiggles that I'm actually passing a function argument here or whatever it is. So I think that's quite nice. And then the final thing to show here is that you can now do this. You can now have an async component. So you can use async await in components. And this is currently exclusively for React server components. But still, I think other frameworks are leaning towards supporting something like this where it makes sense as well. And the code generated, scroll down here, find our make function, looks like this. So it's just a regular async function using await. Yeah, so any questions on the small things so far?
I have one real quick. So I noticed that it was using the suggestion was to say use belts.string.toInt in the error message. Is the plan to kind of continue using or like with those specific suggestions or to canonicalize on a different standard lib?
Yeah, as soon as we move the new standard library into the compiler itself, it's going to be, we're going to obviously like recommend that instead. And at that point, it's going to be int to string instead of belt.int to string. So yeah.
And then similarly, I mean, since you already have that as like a suggestion, are you thinking about maybe adding that as like a code action or whatever it's called inside of VS Code?
A code action to...
Oh, so you could hover over the string and it's like, quick fix this, and it will automatically wrap it.
That already exists, actually. Every one of those is going to have a code action. Before I did the error message updates. Let's see if it works afterwards as well. But yeah, I can check that now right away, right? We probably can't see here. Yeah, so it gives you that.
Amazing.
But this in turn isn't going to work because this returns an option. Okay. That's it. Whatever. Things don't have to compile. Yeah. Anything more about that before we continue?
There was a question, well, a note about suspense, but I think that's already kind of covered. And yeah, people seem to be fans of the new error messages. Good job on that.
Cool, great. Yeah, I'm hoping it's going to improve the situation a lot, and we can do many things here to improve things even more. So again, like please do come with feedback. Yeah, okay, then let's move on to, let me check my sheet note here. Yeah, dynamic imports. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to cover two things here. or yeah, it'll be 2 things, but it'll be kind of 3 things, but still. First off, dynamic imports in ReScript was kind of tricky before, unless you wanted to import something that was a top-level library, essentially, where you could just do you could bind to the import function and just pass it a string and a type that you know what it was, but still, like, it wouldn't be, For dynamically importing your own components, that was hard. Like, you'd have to put things next to each other or always know the relative path and the ending you configure in bsconfig and everything. So work has been ongoing to make this much, much easier. And I personally think that now we've reached a point where this is really nice to use, and even like better than the JavaScript equivalent, essentially, because you don't have to remember any paths here. First off, the first thing I'm going to show is how you now do a lazy React component. And a lazy React component is a React component that is dynamically loaded the first time you render it. So it's not loaded before you render it. The first time you render it, it's going to load and then render the actual component, kind of. This is in the next version of ReScript React, which isn't released yet, I believe, 0.12, I think. But still, like, so what you do here, this is the important part, is you use js.import and you pass that a function, a link to any function in another file, essentially. And what it spits out is this. Let me go ahead here, and I don't dare closing this one down though. But yeah, this one, it now knows the URL to your components, and it also can pluck out kind of your. Let me bring this back. It's confusing. It can pluck out your exact thing you're using here. So the make function, for instance. So just a regular like dynamic import. So it's js.import, and that creates that. And you render it then like you'd render any other React component using JSX and passing the if we look at this, passing the properties you have. So that's the first thing, and that enables lazy components, but it also enables just general code splitting and dynamic imports. You can just point to, if you're looking to use a single function, it will, even if you're like, you're pointing to a specific function here, but it will import this entire generated module, so you don't have to worry about that. It's not like kind of stripping anything out. But this is good. And then in the cases where you do want to use a full module, you can use this type of syntax. You just await the module you're after. And then you get that module back, and you can use that just as if you had it imported already. And the JavaScript generated for this looks like this. Var int utils, await, import, and this was a belt module, but you could have used your own module, of course, and they would know the difference. Yeah, so that is
the module itself doesn't have to have any like special preparation. You can just do that on any module.
Yeah.
Wow.
So just anything. There's no preparation needed on it. There's some preparation needed on, or there should be some preparation needed on lazy, but we've added some a fix for that, so you don't have to worry about that either. Like in regular React, you have to have a default export, for instance, but here instead we take care of that synthetically and create that default export. So it's not really possible for you to mess it up as long as you import your actual make function. Yeah, so that's that for that. And personally, this is something I've been struggling with for very long, and this is such a welcome addition. And also the fact that it's so easy to use, I think turned out much better than I even hoped. I was expecting maybe some other type of solution that would have been slightly less easy to use. So a big shout out to everyone who was involved with building this. Great work, and happy it lands in version 11. There's also a blog post about this that you can check out. But yeah, and that's also been a thing with ReScript. It's with selling ReScript, kind of, that you it's hard for you to someone's always going to be talking about code splitting and bundle size and whatnot. And previously we had no good solution for that, and now we have a really good one. Next one. Variants. So Variants has a bunch of new kind of characteristics and features in version 11. I'm going to divide these into two major areas. First, we have changes and additions to regular variants, which I'm going to show here. And then we also have something called Untag variants, which is going to help immensely with binding to various like weird JavaScript and TypeScript APIs. But starting out with just what's new with variants, you can now use spreads. So here you have a variant that has 3 constructors, and here you have another variant that spreads that old definition and adds its own new constructor function. This is going to make it much easier to compose together variants, and you should think of all of these spreads. We're going to show record spreads as well later on as being type level copy pastes. So there's no like, it's not an intersection or anything like that. It's just literally a copy paste, which is good because it's easy to reason about kind of. So what happens here is that these constructors are just added to my variant. We've also added coercion of variants, both coercion between variants and to things like strings and ints and whatnot, which I'm going to show here. Here, for instance, I create a type constants variant. You can see here that it has the type constants. I then spread constants into my variant. I can then, if I want to represent this one as my variant instead, because it's included here, I can coerce that variable into my variant. So it's now considered being my variant instead of the original one. And this is, you can always go like upwards where you can coerce to something where this is included. So that's useful for instance, when working with AST nodes, where you typically have a bunch of like mingling of, you have some nodes here, some nodes there, and then you have a big union of all of the AST nodes, for instance. And this is going to make it much easier for you to break things up and make it more maintainable, usable. And then another new thing is that the runtime representation of variants has changed. So previously, this would compile to numbers. It would be, I think it would be like 0, 1, and 2. Now it compiles to strings instead. So if we open this compiled file, you can see that all strings is 1, as string when we're coercing to string, still 1. And this is important because of a bunch of things, especially for debugging. That's one thing. How many have opened your generated ReScript code and seen a nice little comment that this 0 means 1 or a user or whatever, and then went to log things in production or in development and just seen 0 because comments obviously aren't logged from your source in runtime. So it's been really hard to debug things. But this is also much more what you'd expect, and it opens up for using this to represent external data, which is arguably one of the more important things here. That previously you could use polymorphic variants because they had a runtime representation that was exactly what you put in them, and you could use that to model data coming from external APIs or config options or whatever. But polymorphic variants aren't very good overall. Like, they have their use cases, obviously, but regular variants are much better. Like the error messages are better. You can add documentation to them. They are less confusing with inference and those types of things. So variants are something that you should kind of prefer when you can. Anyway, there's a good section in the docs about this. So the runtime representation has changed. Together with coercion, that means that you can turn anything that's represented as strings in runtime variants into just a regular string. So you can coerce this all strings. It's actually a variant. We can coerce this to a regular string easily via the string operator. And it's still possible to customize the exact runtime representation of variants, or still possible. This wasn't possible before either. It was always ints. But now you can actually customize this. So if you want to have an int representation, you can do this, for instance, as 1, 2, 3. These are going to be 1, 2, 3 then in runtime. And using coercion, the same kind of rules apply. You can now coerce this to int. If you were to remove this as, you could no longer coerce it to int because all of the members aren't going to be ints at runtime. And you can
are you able
anything
to put anything in there? Okay, yeah, I was just about to ask.
We're coming to kind of anything when we talk about Untag later, but you can have floats there, you can have strings there, and those types of things.
How about like a JSON null?
You can have JSON. Let's see here if you can do this here. If we go ahead and comment this one out, or if that's tied. I don't remember if this is tied to the. Yeah, you can actually. Right, yeah, we have. Yeah, this is what we're going to talk a lot more about this runtime representation for Untag variants as well. That lets you expand on this a bit more. Yeah. Then one of the major things this enables is that you can now bind to things coming from TypeScript or JavaScript or whatever in a much more easy way. So, for instance, you can also customize what the discriminator looks like for your variant. So, imagine this API in TypeScript. You have a type response. It has a discriminator on kind that's either success or it's failure. If it's success, it has a message key, that's the string, and if it's a failure, it has a reason, that's the string. You would bind to this zero cost using the new representation this way. You would say that the tag for this variant is called kind. We have a type response. We want this, since variant constructors can't be lowercase, it has to be uppercase. We're free to just customize whatever this is at runtime, however we want. Now we're saying success because we want to bind to this thing, but this could be a 1 or a number or whatever. Yep. But now we're using success because that's what kind is called here. We use an inline record to represent this part. And then we use the same thing for failure. And if we look at what these things look like, success and failure in our code, you can see that it's kind success, message okay. Kind failure, reason no. So it's this is making it possible to bind to things that just weren't possible to bind to without adding your own kind of conversions at runtime, because there was no way of getting this into a variant representation, because previously the variant representation would have, like if we remove kind here, for instance, it's tag instead, uppercase, and it would be no way to change this tag thing. So this is I've used version 11 stuff for a long time, and I'm using this all of the time. It opens up so many new kind of ergonomic use cases. Yeah, but that's that for regular variants. Please, if there are any questions, go ahead and post them. Otherwise, we're going to jump into Untag variants, which is a variation of this. And Untag variants is essentially, let me draw like a small, we can take the definition from here maybe, without all of the. Untag variants is essentially variants, but because of the values you put in them at runtime, you can just drop the constructors kind of. So what's left here is going to be it at runtime. I'm not sure if this is going to be explained as well, but I'll get more into this. It's going to be this, either the value A or null. This was also kind of not possible to encode in a good way before, because JavaScript and TypeScript has a bunch of, like it's fairly popular to mix types together just because you're allowed. You can have strings and you can have numbers and you can have Booleans all living happily together in an array, for instance, something that just doesn't work in ReScript or other, yeah, I'm gonna stop there, but other languages. And this is now possible, and this opens up a couple of new things that were notoriously hard to do before. I'm going to do an example here. For instance, imagine you have you're getting a user from an API. Your API, you don't have control over it. So any property that comes back is going to be either the value or null. But there was previously we have JS null.t, but those were all abstract types because there was no way for ReScript to understand the difference between null and the value at runtime without you applying explicit actions to turn it into an option, for instance. And for those of you who don't know, an option is the value or undefined at runtime, not null, just undefined. So the old code before this the Untag variance landed would look something like this. You have a get user function that takes an ID and returns a promise with the user. You would await your user, and then you would take every property here and you would turn it into options, and then you would match on those options, and you would see if you would get your values back. This has a couple of disadvantages. Some of them are larger than others. Before I talk about them, I'm going to show you how it looks in this new version instead. Here instead, you'll be able to, since you're not having to pull out any keys from the record, you'll be able to pattern match directly on the weight. And here you'll be able to pattern match on either there's a value, or if we wanted to change this, there's null. And this is, you don't have to do any conversions. This could be as deep as you want it. So you could do one big switch on nested information, for instance, things would just work. And what's really, really good about this is that dealing with data that's potentially null or undefined and not just undefined has been notoriously hard because there's so much conversion you have to do. So if you have a nested structure, for instance, you break your kind of pattern matching niceness because at every level you'll need to do a new conversion to option, and then at the next level you'll need to do a new conversion at option. So this is a big difference. This is going to make working with potentially nullable data, which is common, of course, much easier. And then it has a couple of other interesting things as well coming from it. And again, there's a blog post about this, so please feel free to read the blog post as well. It explains the rationale behind this and more kind of in details how things work and what it enables. I'm going to focus on kind of real world things here as much as I can. For instance, we've been able to previously, the JSON.t type was an abstract type that you'd have to interface with various functions we provided. Here, we're now able to encode this as a Untag variant. So we now have a type where you can produce almost guaranteed to be correct JSON. With JSON, we don't check for circular references, can't do that. But still enough to cover 99.9% of all JSON cases, just doing this. So we have an array that has a string that's hello, that's number, has a number that's 10, and a boolean that's true. And this compiles into, let me see here, find it. This, just an array with this atrocity inside of it, mixed types in an array. So that also opens up quite a few use cases because you're now able to kind of interface with, for example, JSON then in a way without having to have libraries helping you. Of course, there are good libraries that can help you still, but you're able to do this and interact with JSON in a much simpler way. Another thing this enables with Untag variants is when you, for example, have a value coming from the outside that's either a promise of the value or just the value directly. This is also a fairly common thing in the JavaScript and TypeScript world, that you get back either it's a promise of something or it's the value directly. Here you can model this as sync or async user is what I call it. Either it's async and then it's a promise of a user, or it's sync and then it's the user directly. So if I want to write a greet function here, I can just switch on this value. And if it's async, I just await the user. And if it's sync, I return it directly. And then I can write this down. And if we look at how this is represented at runtime, then see here, you can see that it's async user, what do you have? Yeah, so it's just a promise. And the code compiles to an instance of check in this case. So user, are you an instance of promise? Then await you. If you're not, just return you. So Untag Variants has a bunch of capabilities around like how it can look up what things are in runtime using both like type of and instance of and those types of things. Yeah, so that's it. And the final thing I'm going to show with Untag Variants is a very, very real use case that I have myself. And that is an API that has been hard to bind to before. Let's see here, I even have the TypeScript file here. That's now much easier to bind to. I'll just start with showing the TypeScript stuff. Here, for instance, I'm sorry for it being so small, but I want to keep the context up here, kind of. Here we have a property called logging that can either be a Boolean or it can be a yoga logger, which I inlined here, which is a record of log level and then functions, or it can be log level, which is a bunch of strings, like a string union, string filters, or it can be undefined. This was quite hard to bind to before, or rather, like it wasn't hard necessarily, but you'd have to do all of these extra steps, like encoding all of this yourself. Now you can fit all of this into Untag Variants. If we look at what our, let's see here, logging. There we go. Our create server config here. If we look at logging, you can see that we have a variant. You can pass true or false, the Boolean stuff. You can pass a yoga logger, or you can pass log level debug, info, warn, error. So it covers all of the cases. And if we look at the definition here, you can see that we've annotated it with unboxed, and we've used all of the asterisks that we showed before here. True, false, yoga logger itself, and then string literals. Yeah, so the untag thing, unboxed thing here, untagged, is the yoga logger. That's a record, which is going to be an object at runtime, and it's possible to intermingle that with all of the other things here because it can figure out that this is the only object, for instance, in the variant right now. And I have a bunch of other examples of kind of things that were notoriously hard to bind to before here, but I think you get the general kind of point. If anyone's interested in this specifically, like these bindings and looking at how it can look after Untag Variants, just ping me and I'll link to the bindings in the library I'm using this from. You can have a look at that. Questions, Sean?
No, I think everyone's just pretty excited about all the implications. I'd be curious a little bit about the runtime implications or the runtime overhead, say for the decoding. So it looks like the encoding of it is, there's no real overhead. Everything's unboxed. But for example, the instance of promise check, is that kind of hard coded due to the ahead of time promise and not promise? And does that work for everything, or like how is that actually working under the hood? And do I need to be aware of that at all?
Yeah. You don't need to be aware of it really, because anything that we can fit into Untag Variants needs to come from the compiler essentially. So you're not going to be able to stick your own kind of instance of stuff in there. But the Untag, Christiana can probably fill in more information here in the chat, but Untag Variants mostly use like regular type of checks. Is it a Boolean or is it a string or a number? Those types of things. And then for where that doesn't work, like for instance in promises, where a promise is an object, it uses instance of checks. Yeah. So and it kind of it puts these in the most efficient order as it is. So you shouldn't have to worry about that at all. So it should just work as you you could.
Oh, that's great. And just to be clear, everything you've gone over today is published in the latest release candidate for version 11?
Yes.
So this is easy to get access to? Cool.
Yeah, so it's in RC4. Most of these things have been in many versions of, or pre-release versions of version 11 as well. And then a few more things landed in RC4, which was released earlier today, actually. Yeah. So that's variants. We have a quick one with records before we move on to uncurried mode. And records, the new things in version 11 with records is you can now do type spreads like here, and you can do coercion between records. And this is also enabling quite a few interesting things. The same applies here with type spreads as in variants, that this is a type level copy paste. So you can see when I hover this, we just inlined all of the fields here. And coercion means that you can move between records of the same or compatible shape. And for those of you who do a lot of GraphQL or maybe even use Relay some, you know that there's a few cases where this is very much needed, where you have more or less the exact same structure or very similar structures into types, but because of it being nominal, you're not able to use these interchangeably. You have to map them. And this solves this and many, many other things. There's okay, links doesn't work, but you can Google ReScript MUI, which is Material UI, which Florian and Christoph, I believe, maintains bindings to Material UI. They use record spreads a lot, and it simplifies and enables a lot of the things in those bindings, which is nice. So if you want an up-to-date example of how that can look, then please go ahead and Google that. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a blog post about this as well, record stuff. Like for me, the important thing in this thing is that it enables a lot of the things that is useful about structural things, but while preserving nominality, essentially, things being nominal.
What's the kind of semantics of the coercion that's happening on line 15? Like, is it just taking any of the common records and trimming it down to that? Could I do that and then inline spread it into another type, or like what are the restrictions and what does it enable?
It's still the same kind of way as if you just inlined all of this yourself. So like you can coerce, let's see here, BB, this is extended, and you can coerce the base record into the extended one just because the base record is, but still, like it's very similar essentially, but you'll probably notice it being pretty much just as regular records with in terms of how you kind of fit them together. There's a few like other things that we want to enable with this as well later on, like being able to spread in inline records. That's not possible right now, I believe. That's going to make it easier to kind of share things between variants and records as well. Yeah.
So in this case, like, can you spread B into extended? So on line 8, can you spread that in, or is that's not?
No,
possible?
that's still the same thing that you can't spread other than the exact same kind of type.
Okay. And then on line 15, BB is just going to end up with an ID field. And is that actually happening at runtime, or is that just in the compiler?
No, so it's just at type level. So the same, like the properties are going to stay in runtime as well. It doesn't do any it doesn't spit out, like remove anything. If you want that, you should still like do your conversions. The important thing to remember here as well is, just like Christiana wrote in the chat here, this is explicit. So you never have to worry about things being coerced without you understanding or knowing it. It's always going to be an explicit action that you do in places where it kind of matters. So it's a controlled kind of action. It's not like the regular structural stuff where you don't know quite exactly what it is you're getting in there, but it's roughly the same, the shape it should be. Yeah. So there's no like, I don't believe there's no like runtime for this at all. It's all type level stuff. Yeah. So let's talk about Uncurried, because that's quite a big topic. Yeah, where to start? I've TV Chef prepared two functions here in both curried mode and uncurried mode. That's pretty interesting to kind of contrast. Here we have a function that takes two optional label arguments. It takes a name and it takes an age. I already get a warning here, like this optional parameter in final position will in practice not be optional. And we're going to kind of go through what actually happens here and why that can be problematic, especially for newcomers. So for instance, when I want to get a greeting back where I don't set the age, my first hunch would be to do this. I just apply one of the labeled arguments. But due to currying, what I get back here is not a function. It's not my actual greeting. But when I do want to do that, when I want to have another function that has a preset kind of name, then this works great. Like I get a function back. If we jump over to our Uncurried thing, like before we do that, the important thing here is that it's hard. Like you can't really express this without doing a few type tricks that makes the compiler understand that you actually want to apply the function. And this is sometimes problematic. If we go to Uncurried instead, in Uncurried mode, we have the same setup. We don't get a warning here. And when we call greeting, only supplying one of the arguments, we get a string back, just as we expect. But when we call it and we want to have another function with a preset name, we also get a string back, obviously. So when we do want curry, there's something called partial application instead that we can do. And that looks like this. Now, we've told ReScript that we're partially applying this function. Give me back whatever it is you have still. And we get a function back which has the age. And again, like I said with records, this is an explicit action here, which has been very important in all of this, because this typically is kind of hard to reason about, that you get a function back here in current mode, because it's not explicit. If you're just looking at, you have to keep in your head how many arguments are there, which has been applied. Maybe there are several levels as well of currying. So this is explicit, which helps. And it preserves most of the important stuff from current as well, like just doing partial application instead. You get a function back. That works fine. And like I believe you wrote here, Sean, one of the things that's important here also is that it cleans up the runtime code a lot. You're used to seeing all of these like curry helper calls, like curry.1, curry.2, curry.3 in your code, and they can both like kind of slow down the runtime, of course, but also they're important for like getting rid of them because it looks weird. I mean, it looks confusing. You don't know what it is, and if you're say that you're a new colleague and you're looking at the ReScript generated code, most of it looks good. It looks almost handwritten. And then there's all of these like weird like curry calls. And if you want to understand those, as you're like the colleague of that colleague, if you want to explain that to them, you got to explain currying. And then you're stuck in like a much larger conversation than should just be like, yeah, what it actually is. So it's important. I have, let's see here, I have more examples. There are more examples in a blog post we recently posted as well. But I'm going to try and highlight a few of the things that makes a difference in runtime. Yeah, like Christoph writes in the comments, it's also important for bindings because it lets you clean up a lot of the bindings you have already. Because you don't have to kind of use trading units and whatnot, or one unlabeled argument just to make the compiler happy. Let's see here if I remember what my idea was here. Yeah, exactly. We have an add function here. It adds 2 ints. We're in Uncurried now, and we have a get added numbers that should return a string. Here we get the error here. This is type some function, but it should have type string instead. In Uncurried mode, we get the error at the call site instead. This isn't applied with all of the functions it should be applied with. And in this very stripped down example, of course, this doesn't look too bad, but imagine you're in a function, like in a function where what you did up here didn't matter for the rest of the body until you actually return stuff, and you have maybe several, you have many lines of code between here, and you get an error message that something in some structure somewhere is a function, but it's supposed to be a string or whatever. And that's going to be confusing in many cases. So this is an added benefit also of Uncurried, that if this was really something that you wanted to do a partial application of, you could do this. Obviously, you get the same error in the same location as the other because it's a function, but still, it would be an explicit action, much easier to kind of track and see what's going on. Another one of my, there's talks in the chat as well about this cleaning up, not having to use the dot notation, which most of you probably know about for uncurried functions before ReScript version 11. That's also an added benefit. One final thing here before we talk just in general about Uncurried and how to migrate to it and everything is one of my personal favorites that happened to me, not all of the time, but way more often than I'm comfortable with. And that's this. I have a function that mutates something or does something important that I really wanted to keep doing. This works out well. I don't care about the result. Maybe I get a cancelable left that has a cancel function or an unsubscribable or whatever it is I get back. I don't care about the result. And since you have to handle all of the results anyway, in ReScript, you couldn't just do this because you get an error. Top level must be a unit. So you could do this instead, just because I don't care about the result. And this would be a cancelable, exactly. But you don't care. Time passes, like this still very much needs to run. And I go ahead and I add something like, maybe we change our API and I need to send a username as well. There we go, change. Nothing actually errors here, but my function doesn't run anymore, because if we look at what this now returns, it instead returns a function because I haven't fully applied this. There's obviously solutions to this. One of them is to annotate this with cancelable to say that this, whatever it is I'm returning, needs to be a cancelable. It'll tell me that we're missing a function called an argument here. But still, this is a pretty simple type. Sometimes you get back really complex things. And remembering to both add these annotations, like people are going to add those once and then they're not going to add them because it'll work, like it'll be fine. It's overhead. And then also maintaining your own kind of type annotations is annoying, so to speak. And this is something, again, like this is something that has happened to me many times, that you do a change somewhere and you trust ReScript so much, of course, because it's sound and the type system is really good and you're used to being able to fearlessly kind of refactor. But then when you get back to it, things don't work and you end up with production bugs, kind of. In Uncurried instead, Sean, please go ahead.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. In Uncurried instead, you would get the error directly. There, you'd get the error right away because it doesn't have all of the arguments itself.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of these changes. So there's some questions around kind of, uncurried by default, occurred by defaults, and syntax and that kind of thing. Like, so I've been bit by this as well, and so I have a habit of annotating my ignored variables. But the thing is, that's like it's a muscle memory that you develop from the pain that you walk down a default path and it hurts. And the idea is, well, if that's the default way that people are going to go, maybe we can make that the correct way, like the much more like the pit of success type of thing. And you can still reach for the other methods, right? You can still use the curried one, but it's much more explicit. It's not you're accidentally walking into that and then hitting some of these painful edge cases. So everything's still accessible and still available. It's just that the default way is much more likely to be successful for the vast majority of people.
Yeah. So with ReScript 11, Uncurried mode is going to be default on. You can still change it in ReScript.json or psconfig.json to be off and have the old behavior. That's what I've done here in the current one. There's also a few ways to kind of enable Uncurried mode per file. There's a lot of like wizardry going on behind the scenes here for how everything is works together with having a standard library that's supposed to be able to run both in, or just in general libraries that's supposed to be able to run in both curried mode and uncurried mode. But we want people to move to this because we believe the trade-offs are right for uncurried mode, and it's something we've been talking about for a very long time. And I've migrated a big app to this, and 99, or like I think I had one type annotation that I needed to change. I don't have an example of that here, but there's I believe there's on the forums a few examples of how certain type annotations can differ a little bit between curried and uncurried. But other than that, all I did was add spread dots for partial application to maybe 30 or 40 places where I had used currying, and I just did that, and things worked. So I think depending on how your app is structured, of course, but most of the things, most of the migration is going to be a lot easier than you'd expect it for this type of change.
Yeah, I also upgraded a medium-sized app, and it probably took me, I don't know, an hour, maybe at most, to go through quite a bit of code and update it.
That's great. Yeah. Any questions about Uncurried? Otherwise, we have a blog post again, as I said, that was fairly recently published about it. You can dig up many discussions on the forums as well about Uncurried if you want that. I personally think that it's fantastic that it's been able to land in this kind of shape and form. And again, like migrating a big app to it was fairly painless. Hopefully we can get like a thread going on the forums or similar, and where people can share their experiences and ask questions about if they're stuck with anything in particular. One of the things we're going to do when Uncurried is a little bit more household is we're going to clean up a lot of the standard library bindings, because we're able to, due to currying, we have a couple of bindings that are split up in many different sub-bindings with different names, just because we don't want to add trading units or make them less ergonomic for the kind of standard use case or happy path use case. One example is getting an optional value with a default, for instance, or just getting an optional value and being fine with throwing an exception, but you want to that exception is you want to add a specific like error message for that exception. The normal use case would be to not add that message, so you'd not want an optional argument there, because that would mean you'd have to put another thing there as well for the compiler to understand it. But now you could put an optional argument there, because if you don't supply it, it'll apply the function anyway. So there's a lot of these types of cleanups you can do, and also getting rid of trading units everywhere. That's notoriously, at least in my experience, notoriously hard to explain why we have to newcomers. I mean, it makes sense when you explain it, but still, it's hard to. It's kind of a distraction, is my experience when explaining things.
Yeah, so I think like on the syntax level, it's probably helps the default case, both the newcomers and the experienced people. Power-wise, you still have access to everything if you need it. It's just an explicit choice. And then in terms of kind of like the overall theme of ReScript, really trying to be able to express a lot of native things in JavaScript with little or no overhead in a very natural way. I think it also lines up very well where currying is kind of a natural thing in, say, OCaml. It's less natural in the JavaScript world. But again, it's still there if you need to. It's just explicit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this the partial application stuff really fills most of the use cases that you'd have for curried anyway, just as explicit. Cool. Yeah, that's pretty much what I had. Are there any questions in the chat or anything that we should take here, or so otherwise I can talk a little bit about going forward and what we're focusing on now and those types of things.
I think there's a lot of the usual kind of consternation and cultural discussions over the value of uncurried and curried by default, but no major questions outside of that, I think.
Yep, cool. So we're going to aim to have another meetup in a month or so. We haven't fully decided on what the topic will be, but we're, like I said before, we're going to try and interchange kind of news from development and people showing off libraries they built or things, and also we are going to try and get production users on here to talk about things like how it is to use ReScript in production and what they're missing and what's working well and stuff like that. Yeah, ETA for release. We need to finish up some docs. We have a few outstanding PRs. I'm not going to say any real like ETA. I can't really do that. But soon, hopefully. Said it for a while, but still. But again, like remember that the RCs now, they are stable, fairly stable, yeah, or really stable. I've been using them in production for a long while, since back in alpha even. So it's
yeah, I haven't used them in production, but I've been developing with them pretty exclusively, and no real problems.
Exactly. Yeah, I haven't had any problems in production either. So yeah, docs effort is the big thing that's kind of making this lag a bit. Yeah, but looking forward to get this out there and get another release on there and working on towards a new kind of goal. Yeah.
There were some questions kind of around, say, the optional field arguments earlier and the status of that, like if that's going to be addressed, say, in v12, or if it's kind of up in the air right now. So the TypeScript has, for example, the question mark dot field access.
Oh, right, yeah. That's we had a proof of concept for that, but where we didn't have the question marks. That there's a thread in the forum you can look at. I think if I remember that discussion well, is that there are certain differences between ReScript and JavaScript and TypeScript that makes, if you want the ReScript API to be explicit, not really look as you'd expect it to look because of options in options. And yeah, Christiana can probably fill in better. There's a forum thread that kind of goes in depth on that. So there's no ongoing work for it now, but I'm sure it could be revived and explored further. But we need to figure out the details much better around it.
Separately from that, so there's some kind of questions about, say, the size of the ReScript community as it is right now, and what are the efforts to actually grow it? And I think a lot of what you went over today is really kind of about bringing the capabilities of ReScript to like making much more accessible to the JavaScript world, but also making the JavaScript world more accessible to the ReScript community via the bindings. Are there any in particular efforts to kind of say marketing efforts or developer efforts outside of, say, this meetup that you're thinking about?
A lot of the work now has been around trying to get the kind of ReScript package cohesive and get rid of things that typically has traditionally confused newcomers, like not being able to buy into certain things. And of course, like the Uncurried things we've talked about now as well, and a few other things. The standard library situation has also been confusing with the JS namespace and everything. So we're just approaching a point where we've plugged the most important and hurtful kind of holes that we've had before. I think personally, I can't speak for everyone, but I think personally that we're approaching rapidly a point where we can start producing much more like content and going to conferences and other meetups and just talking about ReScript and when it's good and great to use ReScript. That's pretty much it, I think.
I'd also like to see, I mean, personally, it's a bit of a personal thing, but I'd like to see kind of more tooling to help the transition, say, between
Yeah.
TypeScript and JavaScript. So one of the experiments that I shared with you is kind of pre-structured prompt for OpenAI's GPT-4, where it's kind of inside of that prompt, it's already kind of been trained on here's what a series of TypeScript components look like when they're converted into ReScript. And so you just paste in your JavaScript or your ReScript, and it knows how to extract the types and do the bindings and automatically create all the resulting ReScript components. And I suspect like a lot of that kind of tooling would be helpful for to grow the community more widely.
Yes, for sure. And the demo, maybe you could show that on the next meetup, but it's really fantastic. It's the future. Yeah, I think that's a big thing. I know Cristiano is working on a lot of AI related stuff as well. And it's that's probably one of the more promising solutions to working on like the transition going back and forth between TypeScript and ReScript. I personally would love to have a way to kind of paste TypeScript into the editor and just have it pasted as ReScript, or a best effort kind of conversion to ReScript, because that's typically how I work when I do bindings. I paste the TypeScript type and I change it to match the ReScript stuff. It's mostly like mechanical and tedious, and the language model could probably do that well. So yeah, I think that's the demo is great, and I'm hoping that's something we can integrate or build upon or whatever. Yeah, would be great.
Feel free. We can take a few more questions, but kind of along the lines of the LSP. So I know you've been doing a lot of effort, and I see, for example, you have extension development host here in your VS Code.
Oh, you're seeing that?
So like how are you thinking about like reliability and stability for that? So I my top run command in VS Code is restart language server. It's always there. Is there like some way that the community can help to track that down? Is that like a known issue? Do you have any thoughts on around stability?
In general, for stability, it's of course a priority, and just try and report as many issues as you can. I know it's hard to, when you're working and things are stopping to work for some reason or crashing. It's frustrating and you get annoyed, and you're not in the best kind of mood to produce an error report that's reproducible. I know, and that's sadly the way of editor tooling, like that. Whenever things are messed up for the user, they're not in the best of moods. But still, like, if you can help us and reproduce things, that's the most valuable thing one can do. There are stability things we need to work on, of course, and there's also feature things we need to work on. But yeah, so just helping out in reproducing things, that would be the most helpful thing, I think, for the editor stuff. And then also, like, if you have things that don't work, if things crash or something doesn't work like you'd expected, please tell us, like, open issues and give us reproductions. Sometimes it's like you talk to someone and they're like, this crashes all the time, and you haven't seen that yourself. There's probably something they in their setup or something in their project that I don't see in my day-to-day, for instance, and then it's really hard for me to fix it. So just help me out and us out by reporting. Yeah, that's the most useful thing.
Got it. And I think there's like maybe one last question. So coming up on time. So questions around kind of community direction and involvement. So there have been lots of contributors, for example, to I think v11, which is very cool. I know that you and Cristiano and Patrick and like a lot of the core members that have been there for a long time have put a lot of effort into this. So is ReScript now fully standalone? It's its own thing, its own organization.
Yeah.
It's not steered by any particular company.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Maybe Patrick can put more context into the chat if he wants to, but yeah, it's fully community managed. we are looking at ways how we can maybe scale up some of the development and whatnot, but right now it's driven by contributions essentially. And then obviously the ones of us who are more actively involved and spend a lot of time working on it. But there's no like before where there was a team from Facebook, for instance, working on it. That's not how it works today, which is also why we have so many contributors. Like so many have been able to involve themselves in the development. No, Bob is not. Sorry, a question from the chat about Bob. Bob is currently not doing ReScript work. He's fully focused on Moonbit, his new language, which is building up at a university, I believe. Yeah. Should we? Maybe that's enough for one night.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Should do this again sometime.
Yeah. See if we can do it again, Sean. It's great. No, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for asking questions. And if you have more questions, just don't be afraid to ping anyone who's working on this to and just ask them or ask them on the forum or whatever. Yeah, one thing I would like to highlight as well that Josh is writing, who I believe has written quite a lot of interesting tutorials. Like, go ahead and create content if you want to. That's very helpful as well. Just YouTube videos. There's a YouTube series a community member is working on right now, for instance, that we can link to. And there's a bunch of good articles on dev.to, and just create content is helpful. I think what we lack a lot is we have a lot of good things in the community and the ecosystem. We lack kind of packaging. This is something Sean is always on me about for the things I build as well. Like, we lack kind of, we have a pretty cohesive story around React. Maybe it'd be useful for us to have a more polished, cohesive story around other ways of doing things as well. Not necessarily other frameworks only, but other like packages for building applications, for instance. I mean, it's all there if you dig, but you shouldn't have to dig. I guess that's the point. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And we'll make sure to soon announce the next one. And thank you, Sean, very much for this.
No, thank you. This was an amazing release. I think everyone's very excited about all the stuff that's coming.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Cheers.